it actually worked today, so that's good news. So again, we're looking at the exposures for dredging companies. A lot of these are misunderstood to start with, and there's some assumptions made just because the types of vessels involved as to the coverage that's needed for employees for a dredging company. And we want to run through those today. Now, this is, of course, a high-level overview. It's not the detail that you really need on any particular account, but this will give you just some general guidelines of the different exposures and how they happen. So when we talk about Admiralty dredging, we've got 3 different types of vessels involved. The one on the left of your screen is called a hopper dredge. She looks pretty much like a ship. She'll have typically a cutter head. We'll talk about that more in a moment, on the bow. And she'll take the dredge spoil, the sand, the mud that it dredges off the bottom of the bay or gulf or river, and put it in its own hopper in that central section of the ship to carry the spoil away. The one in the center is called a cutter head dredge. And literally that device on the front of it is rather like a large drill bit, a bit more curved than a drill bit, but it takes and drills into the mud or to the potentially the light rock that's on the bottom of a river again or a bay, and suckers that up. And typically they work with what they call hopper barges, because the spoil is pumped off that dredge immediately, again, most commonly onto another barge, or occasionally by pipeline over to the shore directly. It does depend where they're working and the environmental concerns of that location. The third is a clamshell, or sometimes called a mechanical dredge. And as you'll see from the photograph there, there's literally a large bucket or pair of buckets on the end of that crane that act and go down, pick up the spoil, pick up the mud, and transfer it in, again, to most commonly a hopper barge to move it away to a different location for disposal. As you can see from this last one, the crane on board that barge is typically a movable crane and goes on and off the vessel as needed. Can be locked down there permanently, but loading and unloading that crane on and off the barge is a very tricky matter, so you don't tip over the barge and potentially lose a couple of employees in the process. So the movement on and off the barge is probably the most critical part of the clamshell or mechanical dredge. We did have recently one employee who was behind the mechanical dredge when it swung. As you can see, that cabin on there where the engine is fairly large, and it can swing back and actually hit employees. So you want to have a no swing zone at the stern of that, on the back of that crane, in order to protect other employees. So in all those 3 barges, they're vessels, and even though they don't have any power, at least in the case of the mechanical dredge or the clamshell dredge, they're still considered vessels. So our employees aboard are going to have to pass a couple of different tests to get Admiralty benefits. Now, if you've listened to some of our other webinars, you know Admiralty benefits are things like the Jones Act. There are actually 5 different types of them. Jones Act is just one of them. But that is the trigger point to get Admiralty benefits. First of all, they've got to be navigable waters. Now, if you've listened to the Longshore webinars, you've heard navigable waters United States. There's no such limitation in here that it has to be the United States. We could have a dredge going out to work in the Bahamas, and if our crew are US and we're US based, they're going to get the same benefits in Bahama water as they would do here in the US waters. We're going to define navigable waters just a little bit further in a moment when we talk about what is not navigable waters. And then spends more than 30% in service of a vessel or an identifiable fleet, or is doing traditional crew duties. There's some case law out there that says in order to get crew status or Admiralty status, you need to spend the majority or a substantial amount of your time in service of the vessel. That doesn't literally mean being the captain or the engineer, but working aboard the vessel. let's look at these three in specifics. Hopper dredge, you're pretty well going to have a dedicated crew to that dredge. They're probably going to live aboard. Not much chance that they're not going to meet these two criteria. Cutter head, a little bit less so. It may be used all the time, in which case you may have a dedicated crew. If it's used less frequently, maybe not so. But the clamshell dredge or mechanical dredge is the one where you really have this. Let's talk, for example, about the gentleman or lady who operates the crane aboard. If they're spending most of their time on land doing land-based duties and then only occasionally go on that vessel, they may not hit this 30% trigger. The problem is when the court set up that 30% trigger, they didn't say, is this over a day, a week, a month, a year? It's just a general measure. So you really want to be very specific about the person and what their duties are and how much of their time spent on board the vessel. To state that another way, over 30% of the time on board a vessel will give you admiralty benefits for that injured person. Or if they're really acting as the captain or maybe an engineer or deckhand, somebody who's doing traditional crew work. As I mentioned, quite often we're going to pipe that spoil ashore, and here you can see a pipe coming out of a sandbank, literally spewing out mud, sand. We don't quite know what's in there. Unfortunately, that can be a real problem. And here you have a person operating a bulldozer, spreading that sand around. Their duties are going to be longshore. They're working on navigable waters, in this case of the United States. If it's outside the United States, we've got a different set of criteria, but in this case in the United States. Or we might have somebody that's on board one of those traditionally admiralty vessels, but doesn't hit that 30% of the time in service. Again, they'll drop back and they'll be longshoremen as well. So we start off with the need for admiralty coverage, and now we need longshore coverage for virtually every dredging operation. They're going to have somebody like this. It may not have a bulldozer, it might be done by literally a bucket or a shovel, but still spreading that sand, working on the shoreline, working on the beach is going to be considered longshore duties. Dredging in a lake. Now, this is a landlocked lake wholly within a single state. We can't get in or out of it, but we have a dredge in there. And the crew of that dredge are exempt from both longshore and from admiralty because it doesn't fit the navigable waters standards. So believe it or not, even though you may have a full-time person or full-time crew in that landlocked lake, they're going to be covered under the State Act workers' compensation in whichever state this is located. Could be a monopolistic state like Washington, could be a free state like Florida. Either way, they still should be covered under the state workers' comp. It doesn't matter how big the dredge is, what type of the dredge is, but if it's in a lake, that's going to be State Act exposure. You see this most commonly in sand and gravel pits rather than the traditional lake, although it could happen that way. Portable dredges is another different type of dredge. Here you see one being launched from a trailer. Looks like you may have a little trouble getting that trailer out of the sand at the end. The wheels are well buried, but nevertheless, here's a portable dredge being launched from a trailer. The question becomes, where is it going to be used? If it's used in a landlocked lake, just like the last example, the coverage is going to be, the exposure is going to be State Act workers' comp. If it's used in navigable waters, it might be close into shore, it might be in 3 foot of water, doesn't really matter, but as long as it's used in navigable waters, then you're going to go through those admiralty tests. Do the people do more than 30% of their time in service to the vessel? Or are they doing traditional crew duties? You use those same admiralty tests and they fail, now you're going to move them back into longshore. So this particular type of dredge is probably the most complicated because rarely can they tell you, oh, we're only going to use it in one location. So the same captain or operator of this little mechanical dredge could be State Act one day, They could be Longshore the next, and potentially even Admiralty the third. It's one that is the most complicated to split out and to agree with your underwriters where to put the payroll. So what do you need? Simplistically, you need all three coverages for every dredging account. The State Act for the landlocked, and maybe some clerical or sales, or maybe some other landlocked type of support, landlocked lake or sand or gravel pit. Anybody working in those is going to be State Act. Longshore you want in there, even if you don't think you have that exposure, for a rogue verdict, for when a jury or a judge decides that this person is Longshore, even though the law said they're not. If you've got real people handling the spoil on the dock, on the beach, then definitely Longshore. But even if you don't, you have defense costs. If you don't have a Longshore, you don't have a policy to defend you. Last is your MEL or your crew P&I. This covers your Admiralty exposures. MEL is typically for non-owned. If you take the basic policy, is typically for people on non-owned vessels, but you can adapt it to cover owned vessels as well if you need that. The P&I is for owned and scheduled vessels. Watch out. If you have somebody working on your vessel some of the time and on other people some of the time, you might need both P&I and MEL, or you might need to remove that non-owned exclusion on the MEL to cover them properly. Here's a quick run through of the different types of dredges and their exposures. Again, I want to reiterate, this is not a substitute for studying any one claim or any one operation in detail. And the biggest hurdle you've got is, once you've understood all this, is getting the payrolls in the right place. Allocating the Admiralty payroll to the crew or the MEL policy. Allocating the Longshore payroll for those people working along the shoreline. And of course, allocating the State Act for the landlocked. But work with your underwriters, work with your brokers to get the payroll allocated in the right place, and we'll win.